Well, welcome everybody to this breakout session. And given how big a room it is, if you'd like to move up, that's great.
Right.
I don't see anybody moving, which is also just fine. So we have an excellent panel here today. People who are very skilled at a number of business models, and people who have a lot of experience actually doing this and meeting people from around the country who are trying to develop a broadband plan or an implementation of a plan for their communities. We want to try to keep this nice and conversational. And I think to start off, we're going to have self-introductions, if we could. So we've got four really great people over here. We have another moderator here.
Co-moderator.
Co-moderator. So Joanne, if you wouldn't mind starting off with an introduction to yourself.
Sure. Thank you. Nice to be here. I'm Joanne Hovis. I'm president of CTC Technology and Energy, and I've worked for almost exactly 19 years on public sector broadband strategies. And I'm an attorney by training, but I think of myself as a broadband analyst.
Great.
Okay, then.
Dave?
I'm Dave Spencer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Treasurer for Northwest Open Access. We are a municipal network that has points of presence really around the state of Washington. And if you're thinking about broadband in your community, we're here to help.
Nice.
I'm Mark Reynolds. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs for CenturyLink. That entails legislative affairs, affairs with the regulators, the state regulators, and also municipal government affairs. I've got 35 years with Pacific Northwest Bell, US West, Quest, and CenturyLink. Nice. So I've been around a while, and look forward to the panel today.
Great. Tom?
I'm Tom Coverick. I'm a managing director with KeyBanc Capital Markets. We are a firm which specializes in many other aspects of public finance besides broadband, but we have worked with issuers in Utah as well as here in the Pacific Northwest. We work with MyNet here in the Salem, Oregon area, and we're the lead bankers for the Utopia Network as well as the Utah Infrastructure Agency.
Great. Chris?
I'm Chris Mitchell. I'm the policy director with Next Century Cities. I'm also the director of the Community Broadband Networks program within the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And through that capacity, I work with Next Century Cities. I told Don that I would sit next to him, so if I go off on any tangents for too long, he can tap me and bring me out of it. I run muninetworks.org, which focuses on what local governments can do to improve internet access. We're fierce supporters of the right to build municipal networks. We also recognize it's not right for everyone, so fundamentally we think that decisions should be made at the local level. And we're supporters of partnerships and other types of approaches, but one of the things people associate with us is getting really deep into the details of how local governments are crafting policy to solve their problems.
Great. I'm Don Williams. I'm going to be moderating the panel. Last 6 years, I've been working with NTIA both on the grant program and then for the last couple of years on providing technical assistance to communities around the country, developing broadband plans, working on RFPs, and just trying to work with them to make certain that they've taken advantage of all the things that it's possible to take advantage of, whether it's funding, local assets, and things such as that. And one of the nice things with working at NTIA is we have been working with communities who are trying to do a lot of broadband planning using a lot of different models. And one of the things I think we're all going to find out today is broadband is truly local. And we heard that from some other panelists earlier in the day. And what one plan is not going to fit another community, even if they're next door to each other. And one of the nice things about working with NTIA is we accept all kinds of broadband models. And that means that when we provide technical assistance to a community, we're going to be looking at every kind of possible model that there is. And I think today we have a great group of panelists who can speak to a lot of those models already. Well, let's get started. So let's see. Mark, let's start with you if we can. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
So
Thanks for having me.
you just got a significant amount of CAF2 money. And one of the things I think everybody's interested in is, number one, what was the process for your application of that? And secondly, what exactly is it to accept that money? What does that entail? And then how is it that when you're thinking of where to invest that money, what kind of metrics are you looking at for making those investments on the assumption that there's not enough money being given to you to do everything you want to do?
Right. I think the easiest way to understand the whole CAF process is to go back to the Federal Universal Service Fund. Federal Universal Service Fund was instituted as a result of the 1996 Act, and it funded roughly $8 billion in subsidies. One portion of it is the high-cost subsidy that's related to the CAF2. Other ones are Lifeline, rural health care, schools and libraries. Those are evolving, as you've heard on the prior panels as we speak. In 2011, the FCC issued an order with regard to the high-cost fund. So this is not new money. This is high-cost subsidy that was instituted as a result of the 96 Act. In 96, when the ILECs were forced to open their markets and their networks to competition, we could no longer sustain implicit subsidies, so they made the subsidy explicit. And based on cost models that determined high-cost areas, we receive funding as an ILEC, as many other ILECs do as well. In the Jenichowski FCC, they decided that that system was somewhat broken and it needed to be redirected and repurposed, and so they decided that they would formulate a transition to a broadband deployment fund with the high cost fund. Our funding under the high cost fund has been frozen since 2012, and at the end of last year, the FCC, based on some very specific criteria, determined grants that would be let on a state-by-state basis to price cap companies. The FCC regulates telecom companies from a price cap perspective. That is, we have price caps, and they're typically the larger companies. There's 10 price cap carriers, and then there's rate of return carriers. The CAF2 deployment is specific to the price cap companies. And the amounts were determined based on $1.67 billion a year that historically has been high-cost funding. And they utilized a cost model that developed a range of funding and also the national broadband map. And that range of funding is between $50 and $200 per location per month. And based on that, and then working with the national broadband map, they identified on a census block basis by state the amounts of money that would be let for CAF2 deployment. I'm probably going way too
No,
far.
no,
I
this is good.
apologize. Okay, so the CAF2 deployment offers were made to price cap carriers. For CenturyLink, the offer that was made and we took the offer in 33 of our 37 states, it's $505 million a year. It represents 1.19 million locations that we have to build out over a 6-year period. Mm-hmm. And to give you a frame of reference, the state of Washington, it's roughly 60,000 locations at a funding rate of about $25 million. And the build out, we have to have 40% completed by the end of 2017. We have to have 60 by 18, 80% in 19, and 100% in 20. And then in 2021, we have an opportunity to cure any shortfalls that we have. There are penalties There's significant reporting that we have to do, but there are penalties associated with not hitting the marks over those years. And so the actual business model piece of that, and many communities are interested in it, and elected officials have been calling us to find out, is my community on the list?
Right.
It's a very important piece of information.
Yep.
And I can tell you that we're becoming more and more certain for 2016 to try to do a 5-year planning or a 6-year planning schedule for 33 states is an ominous task. And especially, with the challenges that are out there in rural America. There's, building cycles due to weather. There's the very rural nature of what you're facing. But given the range that we have to build in the specific census blocks, we will probably build the more dense areas first.
Okay.
And then the less dense areas will be towards the end of the build plan in later years, is what it's looking like. It makes sense economically, and it allows us to build more census blocks or build more locations for the money that we get. We are held to the number of locations, so we have to, essentially come up with a plan that's going to deliver 59,000 locations in the state of Washington over that 6-year period. Now, one thing that's not understood is that as we build out to these census blocks, there's a halo effect. We will be building through communities that are non-CAF eligible, but that were uneconomic for us to serve in the past, and it will become more economic for us to serve. And so even though the bogey is a 60,000 bogey in the state of Washington, we may build multifold more than that during the broadband deployment. So it's a good news story, I think, economically for rural Washington and really the rural communities in all of our states.
Okay. Thanks. Joanne, you've had a lot of experience working with a number of communities of different sizes around the country, and a number of them have involved, 3P, public-private partnerships. I mean, one of the great questions that cities have is, what can I do that puts me at no risk whatsoever to get broadband into my community and become a gig community? Is there such a thing?
No. Here's my longer explanation of that. Traditionally, localities have had two options. One was the zero risk option, which was to ask the incumbents, would you please upgrade your networks or expand your footprint and so on. And absent some kind of factor that pushed for private investment, that really wasn't going to happen. And the other option was the 100% risk model, which was municipal. And those are two challenging options. The municipal options certainly worked for many communities, and I give them enormous credit for what they did. But the incumbent please upgrade, the kind request of an elected official is not sufficient to change the economic calculus that there simply was no rate. There was no return on investment that justified an upgrade, and that's how the private sector makes its determinations. But we seem to be in a moment right now where maybe there's a potential for other kinds of models to emerge, where we see a different kind of zero risk versus 100% risk environment. And that, I think, is the very interesting thing about this moment. I do want to say this is incredibly preliminary. Like, around the country, we have a substantial handful of projects, of data points that show us what public-private partnerships could look like, and we may be on the cusp of something really extraordinary with hundreds of them emerging over the next few years, but we may not, and I'm always really reluctant to predict what will happen in this field. This is not a safe field in which to predict, certainly not anything more than in the relative short term. But there does seem to be a moment right now where there is an appetite on the part of private sector investors and an enormous appetite on the local government side, which is displayed here and has been all morning, for something that's a little bit different. And what I would say is that I think we're seeing the emergence of a class of projects represented by the councilperson from Santa Cruz, California, who spoke this morning, where we're seeing a new form of innovation emerging, driven by local governments. That's so interesting. What's happening in Santa Cruz is that the city is going to build fiber optics to pass every single home and business in the city. But the city's not actually going to do anything else. It's not going to buy any equipment that requires electricity. It's not going to operate an optical network. It's not going to offer services. It's not going to operate a call center. It's not going to send out bills. And it's not going to do customer service. All the things that the private sector is excited about and can do quite well will be the role of the private sector in that model as it's currently developing. And the city will do something that is really in the city's great expertise, which is to build and maintain passive fiber optics in the rights of way. It's a public works project. It's something the city of Santa Cruz has been doing for 100 years. And there are a handful of projects like this around the country. Santa Cruz was actually the second. The first one was in Maryland. And the most recent, and I think the one that's gotten the most attention, is Huntsville, Alabama. And the reason for that is that Google Fiber is the private sector company that's going to lease the fiber, pay the city for use of its fiber, and then operate it and offer services. And the city will purely be in that public works fiber role. So here's an interesting example, one of a handful that are emerging. There are other business models out there, but here's an example of something that's not 100% municipal risk, not 100% private risk. It's shared risk, it's creative, it's innovative, and it leads to the potential for new infrastructure and for competition.
Tom, so KeyBanc's made a number of really interesting loans and funding of a number of interesting broadband projects. You mentioned a few of them. If you're a municipal official, a broadband champion in a community, what does the community need to think about when they're trying to access private capital?
Right. So as a public finance banker my entire career, I will tell you that this is probably one of the most exciting projects to be working on, because when you look at the support that these projects are receiving from constituents, from staff members, from the politicians, and from every aspect of public safety as well as education, there's so many touch points that are positive. But when you address a room that has that much energy behind each one of these individuals and you start talking about finance, I can look out and see people who look like deer in headlights. What we're dealing with is cities who are fiscally constrained. They have limited sources of revenue to build these networks. They have limited abilities to support any type of infrastructure that's required to administer the build-out, whether it's the actual build-out or day-to-day operations, billing, call centers. So I think when you start to look at some of the financing parameters, communities are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with the infrastructures that they already have on their books, much less the infrastructure needs and demands that something like this new endeavor would require. It's a lot different than when I go in and I'm working on a school district financing where they're building a new school and some community members may not be for it and some may be for it, or a toll road, or any number of different types of public works projects. So from my perspective, I think there's a lot of momentum. The issue from the public sector side and the public finance side, both in terms of providing financing in terms of balance sheet, or lending, or in a most traditional sense, or access to the capital markets with investors, is simply that without some form of skin in the game, many potential lenders and many investors will not bite off on an investment. They just will not. And we've seen reluctance pretty uniform. Some of the things that we have worked on include Utopia, which basically was at the outset in 2004, was strictly a project finance-based model where the cities participating in Utopia actually, through an intergovernmental agreement, banded together a number of cities, 11 cities, with their financing capabilities, and they actually backstopped the bond deal with sales tax. So they knew that to a certain level, their sales tax would be tapped, and that is what's being used to repay the bonds presently. But their sales tax would be tapped. We heard the councilman from Sandy this morning talk about how they lent, at their city, they lent their city's credit to a certificates of participation or a lease appropriation structure. And basically, without that lease appropriation, annual appropriation structure, those bonds probably would not have been sold. And quite honestly, they were AA- bonds, so they received very attractive rates in the market. But without that pledge behind those bonds, at least right now, it would be very difficult for municipalities to enter the capital markets or achieve any type of lending from banks where you're going to have significantly reduced rates. So, when you look at the different models, there are different things that need to be done, I think, in terms of financing today. And that's not to say that down the road, as the market matures, that we can't build in certain mechanisms where the bonds could be called early, or where there could be extraordinary redemption provisions, or if the network is sold, or there are certain things that you can build in the financing that will allow for flexibility. And as the market matures, it's a lot different right now to sell a broadband revenue bond issue than it is to sell a water bond issue or an electric utility bond issue. Those are deemed essential services by the investor community and by lenders. And so to the extent one day, and I think there's a lot of us in this room that agree that one day the market will realize that this type of infrastructure is an essential service. Right. Once the market responds in terms of lenders and investors, I think that for the short term, there needs to be some type of a backstop, some kind of a security pledge that's broader than just the system revenues to make these transactions work.
Yeah, so I think most people in this room, at least many of us, and many in Washington, think that broadband is actually a utility. And many times you hear it, it's just as important as water, it's just as important as electricity. And what I hear you saying, and what I hear other people from financial institutions saying is, that may well be true, but the investor community doesn't feel that way yet.
And nor do the banks.
Right. Dave, I want to ask you what you think, in your experience, is the most important thing that a community looking at broadband needs to think about and focus on in the early stages?
Well, I think locally it's the leadership model, making broadband local. And we heard from some mayors today, some of the other panelists that have the vision, that are making things happen and convening the groups together. Well, in regard to financing, NOAA was created 15 years ago on using revenue bonds that were backed by public utility districts. And at the time, it was risky, and it did lead to credibility to embarking on broadband, which of course had to have a detailed business model behind it. I mean, we're all just taking for granted that the homework's been done, that the business models have been created, that the multi-year pro formas and the paybacks have all been done. And in NOAA's case, the PEDs had to back the bonds the first few years when we started at zero revenue, and have reached now a level of sustainability, of course, where we're covering not only the debt payment, but all the capital and all the operations and everything else. And our startup bonds retire this year. So the startup's over. It worked. And looking back at other financing options, public-private's a buzzword, right? It has worked for us. The privates have kicked in millions into NOAA to build infrastructure out, but so has NOAA. We've taken those same contracts and plowed that return back into the network. So it is the public-privates working together. And then finally, we were pointed out by Larry during lunch about the BTOP grant programs, $140 million. Ton of money came into the state. NOAA had 16 co-applicants, not to mention counties, public safety, ports, that all went into securing this money. Mm-hmm. But what's forgot often, there was $40 million in match. I mean, we still had to come up with $40 million to pull this off. And we did that by collaborating, by pooling our resources, public sector, private sector, government. to make it happen. So I think my takeaway is the leadership model, but it's also the all hands on deck. A lot of different models work here. We're fortunately in a good position that we probably have more resources today than we ever have.
Yep, good. Thank you, thank you. Chris, so I know public-private partnerships are incredibly popular in terms of speaking about them, but almost all of them obviously involve some form of local government. And when you're thinking about local government and the risk allocations, revenue allocations, opportunity allocations, many things have to be allocated in a public-private partnership model, depending on what your community is about and what kind of network you want to build. What can communities think about to lower their risk in the long term when they're thinking about public-private partnership models?
It's a good question. I'd like to just make one brief point that we might come back to after I answer.
I'm not surprised.
Which is, I would just be curious, with your answer with regard to investors, I would like to just get a sense from you then. If investors are responding to whether or not broadband's a utility or whether or not it has a monopoly service territory. And I'm just something to think about. But I can answer the question and then, come back to me with your prerogative. I think communities need to think seriously about risk. And when you talk about lowering risk as a part of a partnership and in the long term, the first thing to do is be frank about the risk. There are some entities that are seeking to partner with municipalities that will say there's no risk. And I share Joanne's sort of dismissal of that. If it was possible for the private sector to build these kinds of networks without risk, frankly, the incumbent telephone companies who have been doing it for a long time would have blanketed the country multiple times over. These things involve risk. And if you're working with someone that's telling you that there is no risk to you, you should maybe check with a second lawyer to go over the contract. I think some of the risk that is sometimes ignored, and I'm a supporter of public-private partnerships. I'm worried sometimes at the level at which it is suggested that only public-private partnerships can move us forward. I think public-private partnerships, I'm going to stop saying that, P3s, have an important role to play, but certainly not the sole role. They're going to be a growing role. They're going to take up a larger percentage of the solutions that are embraced, but frankly, we don't have a lot of evidence thus far. From what we have seen, one of the ways that local governments can reduce their long-term risk is by putting in some of the details from some of the contracts we've seen from actually some of the networks that Joanne's worked with. In the case of Westminster and Santa Cruz, the municipality will own the network. And that's important because this is a network that could be around for 20 or 30 years. Your partner, no matter how long it's been around as a firm, it can't plan ahead 20 or 30 years. We don't know what Google's going to look like in 5 years, let alone in 20 or 30. So I think that the ownership of the network is something that I would flag. Another thing that we've seen is right of first refusal to purchase assets that were jointly created in the event that a company is selling itself. And this is turned up. We're working on a case study about a few of these partnerships. And we're just about to go to the press, and this network in Illinois, the partner that was just rooted locally, has decided to sell to a firm that's based with money coming out of New York, people coming out of St. Louis, I guess. No one really knows the history of it. And the community, fortunately, has the ability to negotiate. The community may well stick with that new firm, but they have some leverage. It's entirely possible if they'd signed a different contract that they would have no say over where that network went next. And I think that should be troubling to communities that are putting up effort and in many cases money. But I think the final thing is that if you're working with someone who says, yes, here's the risk, this is where you'd find it, and this is what we're willing to take on, that's what you're willing to take on, that's a good partner to work with, and still, trust but verify. But if you're talking to someone who says there's going to be no risk, I would be very concerned.
No, I completely agree with you. I did a number of feasibility studies back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And when people tell you that the pro formas sing at 20% or 15% take rate, they don't. Not that I've seen. Mark, back to you. What can a community do to make themselves more attractive?
I asked a question.
Oh, good idea.
I apologize.
So, utility,
Right.
Yeah.
To answer your question, I think that, you know, if investors and lenders were going to look at those types of technicals, they would not need a backstop. They would already understand the market. They would understand the industry, and they would be really delving into those types of details in terms of networks and pledges from simply the broadband network. What investors will look to is they'll look right through the primary pledge, and they're going to look to see what's backstopping it and the strength of that backstop, because they really do want to know that the city is standing behind the network, that the city is not only supporting it from a political standpoint and an administrative standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint. So I think, you know, as the market emerges, those types of questions may start to become more germane to a conversation. But right now, I don't think the market's there, and I don't think investors or lenders are at that point to even be able to scratch the surface with those types of questions.
for, you know, private investment in a broadband network in a 3P. So one is a utility tax. Everybody pays, whether you take the service or not. That's a good backstop. Right? You have a sales tax backstop. What about there's also situations where, the private company comes in and says, listen, here's the deal, here's the paperwork, we're going to be partners. I need to make 35 some odd % penetration rate in order to pay back my debt, make my situation whole, pay for operating costs. If I don't make that number, then the city pays whatever the difference is. Is that also a reasonable approach?
Absolutely. Again, the city is on. Is my mic off? I can't hear. The city is on the hook, and I think that's where the rubber hits the road, because I think when you start to look at, again, it's what's behind the debt, the strength of that pledge, the credit's going to drive the structure, to the extent that at least the investors that I work with in the municipal bond world, they're not going to want to be purchasing a corporate credit. We'd have to go a different route then. Okay. So to the extent that there is a municipality that's willing to assume risk, and I think that's pretty much the consensus of this panel, is what I'm hearing, is that there needs to be a risk assumption, and that's changed a lot over the last few years, because I think a few years ago when we would have this conversation, no one wanted to assume any risk. And now it's changing, the risk appetite is changing because there's such a demand. But you know, from our perspective, when we go to market bonds, or when the folks at the bank start to take a look at credit, it ultimately comes down to the strength and the breadth of the revenue that's available to pay for the bonds and to repay any loans. Okay. So I do think, you know, whether it's a take or pay model, or whether it's a sales tax model or a franchise fee model, you know, any hybrid that includes those types of models, as well as just a general obligation, which is obviously the strongest, you know, to the extent there's that peppered in, it always helps.
Okay. Joanne, I know you want to comment on this. I want to hear your comment. But let me preface with this. So one of the things is, so if you have this penetration model where you have to make a certain number of passes, a certain number of those passes have to take the service. I mean, that's demand study. I mean, it's hard. I mean, the demand studies are not that easy to do. So if you're a community and you've got this nice public-private partnership working, but the private company has to make a certain amount of penetration, a certain percentage, how does a community gain some certitude that that's a highly likely prospect?
Well, I can give you an example of how we addressed it in one negotiation, and then I'd love to ask Tom a question also on the finance side, if I may.
Let's get conversational. That works. Let's do that.
All right. So to answer the question, you have a community making a significant investment or taking a certain amount of risk. How does it ensure that its private partner is really knocking itself out to make this thing work? The answer to that is you negotiate and structure the details of your relationship in a very particular way, and you probably can't have too many lawyers involved. I say that as someone who does not practice law, so that's not me marketing. It is me saying protect yourselves at every stage and in every way. In the city of Westminster, which was the city just outside Baltimore that pioneered this model of city fiber with private sector operations from layer 2 on up, the way it was structured is that the private partner wanted to pay based on how many customers it was able to secure. And the city said, well, we don't know how good you're going to be at marketing and sales. We think you're going to be great. You're a great company, but we need to make sure that you are invested in our fiber and at some level in the way that we are. So what we negotiated was a deal where the private partner pays in part based on how many customers it gets, and it pays in part based on how much fiber has been deployed. So that if indeed it does not put the effort into marketing and sales that it needs to make this thing work, it still has to pay the city every single month. It has a financial obligation to the city. And so there's an incentive there for it to go out and bring in business because it's got money going out every month. Related to that, the private partner also agreed that in any quarter in which its obligations to the city did not meet the city's debt service obligations, the private partner would cover 50% of the shortfall. So the private partner is essentially backstopping some of the city's debt. And what that means is that it's either win-win or lose-lose. And that's a real partnership. That's when you start to understand they've smoothed out the risk between the two of them, and they both have to make this work, or they're both in real trouble. And that, I think, is what's so attractive about that model. But what we saw in Huntsville, which is a similar business model, city fiber, private sector operations, is that Google Fiber, it appears, will pay based on the amount of fiber it uses. So Google Fiber, we can all presume, is not going to disclose to the city how many customers it has, or to anyone else, and that's perfectly fine. The city now has a very predictable revenue stream that is based on the city's own rate card for what fiber should cost. And if Google Fiber is not successful in terms of sales and marketing, well, it still owes the city what it has agreed to pay as part of their contracting process. And so that may not be enough to cover all the city's costs. It will have other users of the fiber. It will have other uses internally for the fiber, but it has that predictable revenue stream, and it's not dependent on whether the company is able to bring in customers or not. Those are a couple of different ways that we see these kinds of deals structured to provide some comfort to the city, but there's still risk. There's still a lot of risk.
Okay.
My question, by the way, relates to that, if I may, Don.
Please.
What I want to ask Tom
Conversations are good.
It's really intriguing to me that we do seem to be in a new world in terms of the potential of, well, the interests of markets in financing these kinds of deals. And what's intriguing to me is I know we have struggled over the years to, usually localities are required to go with general obligation debt in order to make this work, because so-called municipal broadband, sometimes it is municipal, sometimes it isn't, seems like a very high-risk matter to the bond markets. And I'm wondering if the Huntsville situation really kind of transforms that. I mean, this is not municipal broadband anymore. This is a debt where the holder of the debt has a long-term contract with the world's most valuable company to pay it X number of dollars per year. And I believe they said it was a 20-year deal. The documents are not yet public. But does that then start to change things? Is there a potential that they could go out, or a city that wanted to replicate that model could get revenue bonds on at least that portion of the debt, where the revenues from a company of the stature of Google Fiber would cover debt service?
I have no idea. I mean, I am not familiar with that transaction, but when I look at other deals that get done, Sandy's a perfect example. Sandy was able to market their bonds. They had 1.35 times coverage on a historical basis, and I believe on a projected basis. And even with that type of revenue coverage, they still needed to invoke the city's general obligation and their full faith and credit. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. That's more of a corporate type of credit than a true municipal credit, because it depends upon if the city is actually willing to, some type of a lease appropriation structure, make those types of payments whole. Are they riskless? I don't have the answer. I wish I did, but I don't know. But it is something that's very different.
I have also questions on Huntsville, but that's going to keep. Mark, what can a community do to make itself more attractive to your company or other private sector companies to either expand in the community if they're an incumbent and they already have assets in the community, or if it's a new entrant to a community. What is it that communities can do to make themselves more attractive, to defray the costs of deployment?
I think it has a lot to do with access. I heard earlier about the HUD program where they're going to require that multi-tenant units be pre-built with access to the tenants. If you take that up a level to a small municipality and then a larger one, you get different levels of access, but access is critical to a company like mine where a community is already built. They may have a lot of aerial plant. If they have aerial plant, access to the poles, if they're municipal poles, assistance in getting access to utility poles would help. Allowing us to overlash our facilities helps out. Even new technologies, micro-trenching, things like that.
Right.
Access is so difficult in a pre-built community that, that often is a barrier to us wanting to expend any money to come in. And, I hear the financing risk, proposition going back and forward, but what's better than to have the provider take the risk and have the municipality essentially smooth everything out to make it real easy for us to make a decision to want to serve that community. And I just scratched the surface on access. There are many other things, favorable tax treatment, the way we market the product, co-branding. You can work your way down through an entire chart. In fact, we've got like a computer program that evaluates public-private partnerships, and we have the most favorable column, where you're going to negotiate and then just say no. But there are things communities can do short of having to own anything, to the extent that they're starved for broadband services. They might want to expend some tax dollars to upgrade their community to make it attractive. And it's not going to be just for my company. It will be for other providers that may want to get into the game too. And coinciding with what's going on over the next 6 years with this CAF deployment, it's really critical because we're going to be looking at communities along the way as we deploy to CAF-eligible census blocks. And those communities that want to raise their level up and raise our interest can do so by sitting down with us. The other thing I would say too is call us. Just talk with us. I mean, we've had communities put RFIs out for a public-private partnership, and we have our plans already on the table to put a GPON deployment in there. And we're going, well, isn't this a coincidence? Do you think we should tell them? But communities should talk with us, before they engage in, very risky ventures, because you never know what we might have on the planning boards. And we can't share everything. Obviously, incumbents are very cautious about proprietary information and market-sensitive information. But we can certainly give you a good idea that what you're doing is not on the right track or it is on the right track. But also talk to us about our interest in potentially partnering. We have a lot of communities that don't talk with us. They run straight to the banks. They get muni fever and take off. But there might be something a lot less risky for them to do by sitting down and talking with their incumbent provider.
Okay. I love the idea of muni fever, by the way. So one of the things that happens, I know we had a number of references to it this morning, in our entire BTOP project, all of our middle mile were open access. So there's been a significant amount of academic articles written on benefits and disadvantages of open access in terms of financing networks and ongoing sustainability. So I'm a proponent of open access because that's what our middle mile networks have been, and they've allowed a lot of last mile carriers to jump onto our networks, or they run by a community and the community itself connects to that middle mile network that we funded in part. But there are other instances where the open access model seems to be almost a disincentive for private capital to come in. So I'm wondering, in your experience, I know you're good with open access, what are the drawbacks of open access from your point of view, if you can find some?
Well, the first is that no one can agree on what it means.
Oh.
That's a real challenge.
That's
And
why we
so-
have paperwork and attorneys. No.
Well, and it's not a dig at you guys. It's that when I talk to people, they sometimes will say, "Oh, we want open access," and then you talk to ISPs, and they're saying, "Well, we want to have a handoff of this kind of technology, or we don't want you to be doing anything along these lines." So, open access can occur in different levels of the network stack.
Gotcha.
And so, the first thing is to get a sense of what you mean by open access. I think one of the challenges is that open access, broadly takes a model. Let's take a monopoly model, and you have a carrier or a municipality building a network. It is hard to get that to cash flow in a reasonable period of time. This is one of the reasons we generally argue there's an underinvestment in fiber to the home networks. They're expensive and they're hard to cash flow. You turn it into open access, and you're adding a third party to share revenues. So of course, it is even harder then to make it cash flow. So one of the things that I think we may see, and we've seen it in some cases, is local governments that say, well, open access on the network, however we define it, is going to be kind of like our roads, where we have different entities using the roads, and we build our roads with massive subsidies. I mean, the user fees from the tabs, the license plates, the gas tax, and all that doesn't come close to paying for our roads, so we subsidize that and we keep it open. And we're starting to see communities talk about that, and in some cases saying we're going to raise our property taxes, or previously, in Utopia Open Access, they said, we're going to put our sales taxes up. And to say, we are not expecting the network to break even financially. This network is not going to pay for itself entirely by itself. Our roads don't pay for themselves. Our network is not going to pay for itself, but it is going to be open to multiple parties because there's a subsidy going into it. And I think that's a bargain communities should be able to make, particularly if it is truly open to multiple ISPs that are going to be using it. But the answer to your question is that fundamentally open access is very hard to make it the network fund its own capital, because the revenues are just not big enough to pay back the capital with the interest rate. The interest rate will generally is what kills you.
Right. So Dave, you've got an open access network, a huge open access network,
Huge.
and a lot of providers on it.
Yes, we do.
So what's your thought on terms of open access and financial viability?
What's that?
Now that I've said it's hopeless, my apologies.
Well, I think the challenge in open access is you nailed it. It's the local loop and making that business case work out, because it is a 10-plus year return on that. Does open access mean you can give somebody an exclusive, maybe like Westminster, for some period of time? I think that's what that meant.
Yeah.
That they have an exclusive for some time to make that work, or to truly keep it open and rely on non-facilities-based carriers to come in and support the retail play. CenturyLink being a facility-based carrier, going to want to use their facilities, right? They're not necessarily going to want to use the local open access facility if it makes more sense business-wise to use there. Will CenturyLink possibly use other people's facilities? I think it's an open question. Will they?
We use yours.
You do. And I would say for knowing that, it works, because we are a middle mile network. We get into the communities. We have ad drops that are the information superhighways in those communities, and we have a lot of people that want to get there. And so we have 100+ wholesale customers that want to get into the local loop. What they do there is really the big question, and I think that's what we're trying to answer in the municipal business case.
And I wanted to make it clear, I like open access. I was just identifying a lot of problems with it. I think, like public-private partnerships, we're going to see more of it. But I don't want people to walk away thinking, oh, it's hopeless. I would say that's why we don't see much of it today, but we will be seeing more of it in the future.
If I
And
can
from the
add
point
to
of view
that.
of investment banks, what are you thinking about open access? Is that a harder sell?
What's going to pay back the bonds? I mean, really, it's that simple. Is a toll road have a certain schedule that allows it to maximize its revenues? Investors, sometimes they care, they want to make sure that those revenues are going to be there when their bond payments are due. And I wanted to revisit the question that Joanne asked me because I've given it some more thought. I think, you know, one of the things to remember too is that it's the uniqueness of each project. The financing model that's put together is going to be just as unique. And so to think that a network will be financed completely with municipal bonds, that may or may not work. It may work with some private investment money. The other part may work with a municipal bond piece. Another part may work with, you know, a true triple P type of solution. So I think as you start to put your model together, whether it's open or whether it's fiber hoods or whatever you want to do, I think that when you look at the financing, you need to look at it as a puzzle a little bit and put things together that make sense and maximize the ability to be flexible, not only as you put those pieces together, but as you think about what's going to happen in 5 years or what's going to happen in 10 years. If anybody had the answer to that, they probably would not be sitting in this room. But I think that to the extent that you modulize your financing components the same way you put together your network, I think on the backside that's going to be very helpful just to make sure you have the flexibility in the future as well as the most cost-effective borrowing that you could possibly have. I think that's tremendous. So I don't think that leaving the room thinking I'm going to do this as a municipal bond issue or I'm going to do this as a triple P is the way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is to engage in all of the conversations with all of the constituents that you have, both on the resource side in terms of your staff and in terms of the folks that are helping you make these decisions, but also to reach out to the community on the other side, and that is the banks, the incumbents. You know, those types of decisions are going to be critical, and it's not just one size fits all. I think everything is going to be extremely unique as each network is going to be.
Okay. I have another question which often comes up both in the past and the last 6 years, particularly the last 2 years with communities I work with. And that is, and you know, I used to do this as well, you know, if the pro forma didn't sing, it wasn't a good pro forma, and you have to put in equity. But increasingly, it seems, for economic development purposes, sometimes the pro forma is not going to sing in terms of revenue coming in, but the benefits to the community in terms of economic development are sometimes hard to measure. They're long-term.
Very intangible.
Yes. So, so I guess my question generally, and I'd like to actually get an answer from all of you, would be great. How does the community think about that part? So they're building a broadband network. They may have a provider who's doing a great job, but not particularly serving the business communities. Maybe they're not going to industrial parks or a port or whatever. On the other hand, they'd like to get broadband to keep their businesses or attract businesses, but that project in and of itself, the network, doesn't exactly seem to be going to pay for itself anytime soon. How does the community think about the other benefits that community has in terms of economic growth, job creation, job retention, economic opportunities for education? Good to have a first whack at that.
Sure. Well, I think it's one of those issues that community needs to define what the return is on the investment. One of the things we've seen from municipal networks thus far is that when you don't define what the benefit is, what you're expecting to achieve, the result is that the return is expected to just be cash flow. It's to be, the network is paying for itself, it's paying down its debt, maybe it's generating some extra revenue. That is by default how people will evaluate the decision of their elected officials. Unless someone, some entity, and it should be the local government if they're the ones footing the project, is saying, look, our goal is to bring in new businesses. It's to allow existing businesses to expand. It's to lower prices through competition. It's to engage in, maybe give us more freedom to lower the cost for certain groups that need subsidized access. There's a whole variety of metrics that we've seen as to why local governments would do this. But I would say that the local government has to just make sure that that's front and present in people's minds, to say, you know, we are borrowing this amount of money, we're taking on this amount of risk to achieve this, and we expect these ends. A, the network's going to pay for itself or not. You have to be upfront about that. Yeah. And if the network is going to pay for itself, that is one of these 5 things that we're looking for in terms of knowing that we're successful. And I think you can define it in those terms. How will we know we're successful?
I think that, again, I go back to the uniqueness of every project in every community. The demographics are going to help decide what type of project there will be, what type of private investment there will be. They'll also decide whether or not they really want to assume that type of risk, whether they go through an election process and they remove their elected officials if they don't like a decision, or whether it goes to an open vote. I think that, you know, from a public safety perspective and from a economic development perspective, those are intangibles that people have a very difficult time seeing because, you know, everybody wants instant gratification. And so if they vote for this network, or they approve the network, or they buy into the network, they want to see businesses pop up immediately. And we all know that doesn't happen. Economic development takes some amount of time. And it's a lot less tangible than a referendum where we all vote for a new school, and the new school pops up and there's school buses and kids going to school. It's a very different process. And I think, you know, from our perspective on a bank side, you know, obviously we have community development initiatives. We know those are longer term. And so it's a hard question to answer. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the ways I've been thinking about it with communities is not so much to quantify what the increase in their local GNP is going to be, or their increase in the number of job opportunities is going to have, but to work with their economic development agency nearby. Regional one is great, local ones are fine. And to see when they go out and they present a package to attract a business into the community, or where they're trying to retain businesses into the community, or in some places I work, just stabilize the population, talk to them and say, how important is it for the people that you're trying to attract, the businesses you're trying to attract, for us to do this? And you know, that really is not something that, you know, you're going to enter into a row on the spreadsheet and say, oops, that works now, we can go ahead and do it. But yeah. Mark, what's your thoughts on that stuff?
You're asking corporate America to comment on altruism?
I am.
Okay.
I'm very diverse.
Well, you could say it in terms of economics, just indirect benefits and spillover effects.
Right. You know, I think it varies by every community. I think a community that has no broadband, it's huge. I mean, obviously, they're going to be willing to pay. They're going to do that cost-benefit analysis up front. They're not going to care if the revenue actually covers it. You know, they're going to be willing to pay more in taxes. But like the city of Seattle, where you're inviting a third entrant in, it's harder to measure, you know, the economic gains of that happening, although they're there. You know, they're definitely there, you know, and, you know, I guess from a corporate perspective, you know, that's something that the community has to decide. And, you know, we are a part of a lot of communities. I mean, we're 3 companies that came together as CenturyLink, dating back to Pacific Northwest Bell and CenturyTel. Served rural America, you know, had significant community relations with these various communities, and it's a very important part of our fabric, you know, and being. And so to see those, you know, there's a great feeling that we get when we go in to a rural community and we're able to lift it up. Now, are we willing to do that for nothing? I don't think so.
I think we know the answer to that.
But that's the beauty of what I went through earlier with a CAF program, and you know, having adequate funding. I think, you know, and I think I heard Mary Beth say something before about coalitions, that we may be able to do a piece of it, and we may be more than willing to do, or we may be willing to do more than we normally would do if we felt that there was equal input, or even greater than equal input from other parties that were involved in in this enterprise. I mean, we are a part of the community. We live here. We do business here. And so, you know, I think there is something to it. I mean, we are a for-profit company, definitely. We need to make profit at the end of the day to keep going. But are you willing to go the extra mile for, you know, to raise your community up? I would say yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Dave, what's your experience with the NOAA network, and how has that contributed to economic development? Do you have any feel for that or numbers?
Wow, I had a feel. Numbers.
Feel is good. Numbers are hard to come by, trust me.
So, yeah, I would say the numbers are in the tens of millions of dollar impact. The investment that the publics have made and the privates to, for instance, the Quincy data centers. You know, huge investment there in Quincy, Washington. I mean, really, potatoes. Now it's the who's who of data centers in the state. Well, how did that come about? Tremendous amount of private investment and public investment to make that work. And that's a macro scale. I think that the point I want to make here on this is we can have effects on a micro scale. Even if a fiber line extension needs to get out to the local hospital, how does that cash flow? Does that tie into a different kind of infrastructure? Can we work with the private sector to make that happen? And the answer is generally yes. And if we can start getting these, you know, one-offs, incremental, put a network together, you know, pretty soon it's working. And for NOAA operates the back office for a number of networks today. We are the 24/7 call taking. We are the break fix. And the idea is it's an economy of scale. You don't need to have 6 people manning the phones all night. You can outsource that. You can pool that effort and make this work on a micro scale instead of just coming in with one, you know, big macro project.
Excellent point.
I would just add, you know, and I know this is a little bit off topic, but earlier in my career I was a banker for the Lambeau Field renovation in Green Bay. And if anybody's been to Green Bay, Wisconsin, you know the economic benefit of the Packers to that community. And when that stadium was renovated in 2000, there was a referendum that was on the ballot, and it asked for the support of the community. Everyone in Green Bay turned out for this. It was an unbelievable turnout for this vote. And for anybody that's gone through a referendum in the room, you know how challenging those can be. And the approval on it was almost 60%. So it was a very, very successful referendum. My point is that I think for a community to understand the true value of a project, they need to know and have some familiarity with the true benefit to the community. Lambeau Field's there. It's the only thing you see when you fly into Green Bay. It's obvious that is a driver of economic development. If there were something that large in a community, then the community should already know about it, and I think the economic development aspect would already be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's kind of the way I would answer your question. I think an informed constituency is one that doesn't really need too much education. They may already know they don't have broadband. They already know their incumbents aren't doing what they need to be doing. So I think it might be a question that, again, is answered not necessarily by a panel, but it may be answered just by the virtue of the existence within the own community and the experience that they have. And that's been my experience as a banker.
Great, thank you. So we've been notified we now have 9 minutes left. We want Joanne
I interrupted Joanne, I'm sorry.
Joanne?
Not at all.
And then I have so many more questions, incremental builds, expansion of iNets, but we don't have that much time. So,
You know, I guess I would just add to this that I think communities should think about this kind of initiative as we're going to have 2 sets of books. The first set of books we're going to capture will be the financial statements of the enterprise. Like, what are we spending and what are we bringing in? And then there's the other set of financial statements that really aren't financial statements because it's so hard to quantify. The mayor of Chattanooga, Andy Burke, says a lot of things about their remarkable gigabit network. The thing that struck me most when I heard him say it was, he said, this changed the way we think about ourselves. It gave a city that didn't have a lot of confidence in itself a sense of an incredible future. Now, I don't know how to quantify that, no idea, but somebody needs to put it on that other set of books. For Westminster, Maryland, that factor is control, and they don't care if it costs them some money. They want to know that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and 20 years from now, they will have an option in town other than Comcast or whatever comes after Comcast. Because there will be mergers and there will be consolidations and there will be shifts in the market. And 20 years is an unbelievably long period of time. We are only at the 20-year mark now of the birth of the commercial internet, which most of us in the room will actually remember. But it really isn't that long ago, which is why it's so hard to predict what 20 years from now looks like. But what Westminster has done is it has gotten a certain kind of psychological and other value out of owning the underlying asset that is good for 40 years. It will always be useful. It's the one thing we know about communications. We don't know what the internet will look like, but we know it's going to run over fiber for the rest of our lifetimes. So that's a non-quantifiable value that they are able to book in a certain sense. And if we think in those ways, I think it helps a lot, because no local government goes into this because they're thinking we're going to make so much money. It's the financial statements that matter. It's all that other stuff. So you already know what the other stuff is. It's just methodically thinking it through and trying to catalog and express it, even if you can't express it in monetary terms.
Great. I know I have many more questions, but let's go to the audience and ask questions, and the mics will be passed around. Thank you.
Well, just wanted to say, I think the interplanetary system will be wireless, but everything else will be fiber.
Like I said, not in our lifetimes, but okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Our county is very fortunate to get a NTIA BTOP grant.
Yes.
Knowing it did a fantastic job deploying that to our county seat, and big economic boon to the county seat. The problem is that's only 10% of the county. The other 90% of the county doesn't have anything, and it's a real problem in our county having we brought it only to the county seat because of the way it came through Highway 20. So the rest of the county is on Quest Legacy and CenturyTel Legacy, and so we're trying to work with CenturyTel on what is going on with those CAF 2 plans, because the other committees that are here with us today are trying to figure out, do we overbuild that, or do we need to know what CenturyLink's doing so we don't overbuild what they're already doing. So we've had meetings with CenturyLink, but my question for Mark is, how do we work with those, with the operation managers, so the leadership of the county can work and not overbuild and try to do it twice?
It's a good question. What's the community again? I apologize.
It's Stevens County up.
Oh, Stevens, that's right. Okay.
North of Spokane.
Yeah, got it. You know, we will sit down, we'll talk with communities. One of the problems we run into with our CAF funding is that we do have more locations identified than we have to build to. And so we have flexibility in shifting build plans around. We are fairly certain about what we're going to do for 2016. And, you know, as I said earlier, it's an awesome task to try to plan, 5 years out in a build plan. I'll tell you what, after this is over, let me talk with you a little bit and see if we can't put something together and provide you with some better information. It's very difficult because one of the worst things we can do is say, well, you're on the 2018 build plan, and we get to 2018, we take a look at that build plan, find out that that's an uneconomic build, and we've left you sitting for 2 years. Is that worse, though, than giving you some information up front as to whether you stand a chance? I understand what you're up against, and we're sort of in a difficult position. We have to be prudent and cautious about how we talk about what our build plan looks like. We do have a tentative build plan over a 6-year period The only one that's final, though, is 16, but let's talk. I mean,
Great.
for sure.
Another question?
Hi, Fred Johnson. I know it's a little utopian in the current political moment, but is there anything the federal government could do to help with the access to capital problem that seems to keep coming up here?
We've been talking about an infrastructure bank for a long time, and Broadband is part of an infrastructure bank, which is part of the Clinton platform. I think would be a really interesting model or variations on it. Access to capital, some support, some kinds of maybe modest loan guarantees that would potentially change some of the calculus, I think would be really interesting. I wish we were seeing similar suggestions coming from both parties, because I don't see why there's any partisan element to this particular issue. But that, I think, would be one relatively powerful tool that's still pretty modest. It's not massive funding, although that would be nice too.
No, yeah, 1 minute. Let me just say, Fred, really nice to see you again. I haven't seen Fred Johnson in quite a while, and I saw him here today, and we went, wow, this is great. But one of the things that was really successful, if you look at the tobacco settlement money, I mean, that's been incredibly helpful throughout all the tobacco regions. If you take Virginia, for example, that's funded literally a couple thousand miles of fiber optic plant throughout southeastern and southwestern Virginia. And that's enabled all kinds of businesses to relocate there, including call centers, a Microsoft facility. And that would be really good because, in fact, the tobacco areas were hurting just like the coal industry is, and we're out of time.
Let me just, 10 seconds. I would say
It's not up to me, it's up to this woman
skunk
right
at the
here.
party. There is no lack of access to capital for communities that are willing to take on some risk. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but one of the things we've seen is that where investors know they're going to have security, they will give you money. It's still out there.
Well, let's give our great panel a round of applause.